You know, they say that detours are a part of life, and I certainly have taken my share of them. And that's literal detours, that is. Having lived in 3 different states, it's really not uncommon to have come across road construction or maybe even blizzards or car accidents. Or there were a couple times in which damage from a recent tornado, like 20 minutes before, had sort of cut off the road, and we had to go around and take a different highway. There was one time in high school when I was in the back of someone's car, and long story short, we sort of fell off the on-ramp going from East Bush Lake Road onto East 494, and we jumped over a chain link fence and went over a frozen lake and through cornfields and all this sort of stuff. And we ended up on this one road that we sort of needed to figure out, well, gee, now this is a different detour. We need to figure out how to get home. We figured out that we had survived, and so now the next job was to get home. So even though detours might lead you to go out of your way completely, or maybe they don't make any sense to you whatsoever, or maybe they're even counterproductive to where you think that you need to go, they're a reality, and eventually they are hopefully going to get you to where you want to be. Joseph's life had taken quite a detour. From being the golden boy of his father's home, to being a slave sold by his brothers, to being an inmate in the prison of Pharaoh for a crime that he didn't commit. Joseph's life was not one that he would have chosen for himself, nor is it a life that he would have ever even imagined that he would have ended up with. Yet even though God recalculated the GPS of Joseph's life direction, he was always on the road that God wanted him to be on. Joseph's suffering, and as we'll see here today, his exaltation was part of God's sovereign plan to protect and save his people. And it's a foreshadow of what God would do in Jesus through his suffering and through his exaltation to save us. And our goal for today is to see our place in this story and learn how to handle life when God doesn't just give us a detour, but maybe gives us a completely different direction. And the first thing that we need to do is we need to wait on God's timing. We need to wait on God's timing. We have a highly psychologized world right now, and it seems like there are new conditions that are labeled every week. And I can empathize with a new one that just came out. It's one that's called sidewalk rage. Now, it's not as bad as its older brother, road rage. It's not violent like that. Sidewalk rage is basically that feeling that you get at the mall when you're trying to get to where you want to go and there's some slowpoke right in front of you that's bottlenecking the entire crowd. Or maybe you have felt it when you're at the grocery store and you are in the express lane and you notice that the person in front of you has conveniently noticed it's not an express lane. They have more than 8 items, and guess what? They take out their checkbook. For some of you right now, you're experiencing this because you just can't wait for this sermon to get over. And I hate to break it to you, but I have 4 points today. They're going to be short, though, hopefully. The sidewalk rage can actually transfer into our view of God. We struggle with things. We're hurting. We're messed up. We want answers, and we just feel like God is still on dial-up, and we're just totally on high-speed internet. And the story of Joseph, particularly in the chapters of 39 through 41, shows us that waiting on God is necessary for us to live out the plan that God has mapped out for our lives. And waiting on God forces us to come to grips with the reality that God is the driver of our life, and we're just in the passenger seat at his mercy for wherever he pleases to take us. So 2 years had passed since Joseph had any hope that he was going to get out of this prison that he was wasting away in. 2 years ago, he correctly interpreted the dreams of two of Pharaoh's servants, his cupbearer and his baker. And as we saw in the last verse of chapter 40, it not only gave a commentary on why he was still in prison, but it also was a fitting summary of the past 13 years of his life. It says in chapter 40, verse 23, "Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him." We had mentioned that seemingly at this point, all hope was pretty much gone for Joseph. However, after essentially 13 years of faithfully waiting from the time that his brother sold him until this point, God intervenes by giving Pharaoh a set of dreams. In verse 1, the narrator, he details the dream. It'll be repeated 3 times throughout this chapter. You can read it in your Bible, and I'll have it on the next 2 slides if you sort of want to see the details of what's going on, but let me summarize it for you. The first dream that he had was Pharaoh was on the bank of the Nile, and as he was looking at the bank of the Nile, he noticed that there were 7 fat and healthy cows that were eating the reed grass over by the Nile River. And suddenly, 7 really skinny, sickly cows came out of the Nile and ate the 7 healthy cows, and they didn't expand. They didn't grow at all. They just still kept that sickly look to them. Pharaoh woke up. He was disturbed, but he was able to get back to sleep. In the second dream that Pharaoh had, he had dreamed that he was in like a wheat field at the time of the harvest. And he had noticed a stalk of wheat that had 7 ears that were healthy. And then grew up next to it was another unhealthy stalk in which had 7 ears that just looked terrible. And they swallowed up the 7 good ears of grain on that one stalk. Pharaoh, he wakes up. He's rightly disturbed because dreams were a big deal in Egypt. And he was Pharaoh. He was considered a god in Egypt. He was part of the pantheon of what they believed. In verse 8, he calls all the renowned magicians and the wise men, and they're totally unable to help him. And then and only then, God steps in and brings Joseph to the mind of the cupbearer, who takes it upon himself to tell Pharaoh, hey, you know what, there's this Hebrew guy that when I was in prison, I had a dream, and he interpreted it for me, and everything turned out the way that he said it was going to. I was restored to you, and the baker was hanged. So in verse 14, then, it says that Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit. This is a big deal. Now, you may have been praying for something way longer than 13 years. You may have been praying a lot less time than that, but it seems like a whole lot longer than 13 years. And it can be tempting to think that God doesn't hear. Or maybe that he can't do anything about what you're going through. Maybe you're tempted to think that maybe God doesn't care. Or maybe you are on the verge of giving up. Well, what we have here before us is a word that is for you. Because we can be tempted to think that Joseph's release was his reward for waiting. But in reality, it has nothing to do with a reward. It is the sovereign hand of God bringing about his plan. And oftentimes we can beat ourselves up thinking that we're not good enough, we're not obedient enough, we're not praying enough, we're not whatever enough, so that God is obligated then to fix the issues that we are facing. But God in his omniscience and God in his sovereignty brings about his desired outcome in his desired time for his glory and the good of his people. So you may not see why God has you where he has you. But what you can see is that God has you right where he has you because he has your ultimate good in mind and the good of his people. We are an impatient people. We all suffer from sidewalk rage when it comes to God. But could it be possible that God is up to something in your pain and in your suffering and in your waiting? We need to wait on the Lord. And secondly, we need to have confidence in God. Have confidence in God. One thing that I would think would unite every single one of us together is our ability to think more highly about ourselves than we ought. Think about it this way. Let's say that you have a talent or you have an ability or maybe a skill that someone comes up and they praise you for. It's difficult at that moment to not get a smile on your face and pride in your heart and think, well, I don't mean to brag, but, kind of a big deal. And maybe you don't think about this, but when you're in a conversation, how often do you take inventory of how much you are talking about yourself compared to drawing something out about someone else in the conversation? How much are you wanting to focus on them rather than yourself? We are a people who are bent on having confidence in ourselves, confidence in our abilities, confidence in our accomplishments, and everything that has to do with the word me. Well, when Joseph went to Pharaoh in verse 15, he recounts that Pharaoh said to him, I have heard it said that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Now, that's a very strange gift. Remember that Joseph here, he is in front of the most powerful person in the entire world at this point. He is a leader who is considered a god. And it would be really tempting to kick into self-preservation mode and put the focus on yourself rather than on the Lord. But Joseph doesn't do that. He has absolute confidence in God. Look at verse 16. It says that Joseph answered Pharaoh, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. So notice that Joseph realizes his inability. He recognizes God's ability and testifies it to the one who thinks he has all the power in the world. Joseph doesn't need to feel the need to perform. He doesn't feel the need to feel as if his value and his worth comes from what Pharaoh thinks about him. Yet many of us live in that sort of mindset every single day. We are dependent on getting recognition for our accomplishments. Some of us are dependent on getting that shot of dopamine when we send out a status update on Facebook and we see how many likes we get, or maybe that one person who likes what we put out there. Some of us come home daily and we wrestle with the lack of respect that we have gotten from our peers or our coworkers or maybe our spouse or our children. And Joseph doesn't trust in any of that. He knows that the spot in which he stands is not on the stage, but rather he is the one that is holding the spotlight on God who is on stage to illuminate his greatness. And he tells him that the dreams mean the same thing. Look, God's going to usher in this 14-year period. 7 years, the first 7 years will be the best years that your farmers have ever had in the history of Egypt. The last 7 years are going to be the most devastating because an intense famine is going to come, and it's going to be more intense than we have ever seen. And this would have been both a political blow as well as a spiritual blow to Pharaoh, because the Nile was crucial to the life of Egypt. Every year, the Nile would flood and it would provide moisture for the ground and irrigation for the ground in order to have well-watered and well-grown crops. But a time is coming when it will dry up significantly, and there isn't a thing that Pharaoh can do about it. But then Joseph lays down perhaps the most confident statement about God yet before Pharaoh in verse 32. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. So not only was this foreign god that Joseph brought into Pharaoh's courtroom able to give the meaning of the dreams that Pharaoh had, but this is the very one who will bring these events about. This is a God unlike any God that Pharaoh has ever encountered before. It was a threat, but it was also a breath of fresh air. It was life-giving. And Joseph's confidence continues in verse 33 and following when he gives Pharaoh the plans for mitigating this worldwide famine. His plan is such: appoint yourself a wise man who can be, for lack of a better term, the famine czar, and can oversee the famine. And then tax everybody 20% for the next 7 years. Store up all the crops, and then sell it back to them when the famine hits. Now, this was a leap of faith, because no one likes taxes, and here they have to wait 7 years before they see if the government was right in predicting this to happen. And friends, we all know how efficient the government can be. But Pharaoh liked this plan, and to Joseph's surprise, he made him the famine czar. Everything that Pharaoh is doing for Joseph is oddly similar to what Joseph's father did for him back home. He was the exalted, favored son over all of his brothers. Jacob, his father, gave him a robe of many colors that symbolized royalty. Pharaoh exalted Joseph and put new clothes, royal robes on him, and jewelry so that all of Egypt could see that he was the recognized one, that he was the one who had authority. Jacob sent Joseph with his authority to find his brothers. And Pharaoh gives Joseph the signet ring, in which whenever something was an official document and it was poured wax on it, and he would put his ring in that wax. It was the official seal of Pharaoh. So whatever Joseph signed in that way, it was binding, as if Pharaoh himself were to sign it. He is given a new name, Zaphnath-Paneah, which we don't exactly know what that means. It's an Egyptian name. He was given a bride, and it wasn't just any bride. He was given Asenath, who is the daughter of the priest of On. Joseph has, in every respect, been replanted into a new family. He's adopted a new culture and incorporated a totally new life. And as we'll see here, Joseph is not forgetting God. Rather, his confidence in God has brought him to this place in which God is putting all of the puzzle pieces together in order to reconcile him with his brothers and to save God's people. Because Joseph's tax plan here will not only preserve the Egyptian people, but it will be the avenue by which the nations come to God's representative there in Egypt. And the trouble with reading a story like this is that there's a risk of running into what we call moralism. That if you just follow this formula, And if you're just like Joseph, having confidence in God, then God is going to raise you up to your best life now, that you will be healed, that your relationships will suddenly mend. And those things might happen. But for many of us, having confidence in the Lord is simply trusting that He is setting the stage for His will to be done in the midst of your chaos, in the midst of your pain and your discouragement. For most of us, having confidence in the Lord is knowing that whatever comes our way is fixed by God, and He will surely bring it about. And if it's fixed and appointed by God, then we can have confidence that He will be with us in and through whatever it is that we face. So we need to have confidence in God. Thirdly, we need to look for God's work. We need to look for God's work. Processing life in God's detours also means being actively involved in looking for what God is doing in your life. One question that I love to ask people, and it's a question that most people aren't ready to answer because they don't think about it that much, is, man, what's God up to in your life? What are you learning? What is God showing you, in your daily time with God or in life? What is God showing you? How are you growing? If we were to ask Joseph that question, he could have easily answered, well, God is using me to provide for the future of Egypt. But that's not how he answers, how he sees God moving in his life. Instead, we see him answer that question in how he names his children. Verse 51, he names his first child Manasseh. Manasseh means forgetful. Now, that's an awfully strange name to name your kid, but Joseph named that because he said, God has made me forget all my hardship in all my father's house. So wouldn't it seem odd to name your kid after a proposition saying that I have forgotten all of my past life, but yet every time you call your son, you say, hey, forgetful, come here, reminding you of everything that you have faced in your life. But I don't think that's what Joseph was meaning to do when he named his son Manasseh. Obviously, he didn't forget his past. How in the world could he forget his past? For those of us who have had trauma in our background, you can try years of therapy and it might help you deal with those things. But it's never going to make you forget those things that happened. But in God's providence and His love and His goodness, He redeems those things. And He puts them into context of what He is doing in your life today. He takes all of those scars that we bear emotionally and physically, and He weaves them in to a coat of many colors that we wear to display His grace in our lives today. And his second son He names Ephraim, which means fruitful. It's a constant testimony to the fact that Joseph isn't at home. He has experienced trauma, but in God's providence, he claims in verse 52, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. It is possible by God's grace to see the rainbow not only after the storm, but also in the middle of it as well. And that is the story of God's grace in our lives too. I don't know what you're going through, but life can often feel like we are in the land of affliction, like Joseph, and that there's no way out. But we can thrive in God's grace. He can make us both forgetful and fruitful in whatever we are going through. And let's be honest, folks, some of us have gone through some pretty horrendous things in our lives. And you might be now. But God is a God who, as Isaiah said in Isaiah 61, he's a God who grants those who mourn in Zion to give them a beautiful headdress instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, a garment of praise instead of a faint spirit, that they may be called oaks of righteousness, the planting of the Lord, that he may be glorified. God will do this. In him, he will redeem the past and make us fruitful if we lastly know where to get bread. If we know where to get bread, and that's our fourth point. Joseph's story is shaping up to culminate in the world coming to him in order to get grain, and ultimately in order to live. But again, we have to be very careful when we approach especially Old Testament texts to avoid a moralistic, be like the hero type interpretation. We must see how the immediate text that we're looking at fulfills what has already gone before it, how it fulfills what is going on right now in the text, and also use it as a hyperlink to what God had planned in the future. And there are plenty of clues that he gives us. It's clear that God is using Joseph as the contemporary way in which his promise to Abraham is coming about. Way back in Genesis chapter 12, God promised this to Abraham. He said, I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and to him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. He reiterated that promise then in chapter 22 when he said, and in your offspring shall all the nations be blessed. Being then one of Abraham's offspring, Joseph has been fruitful and multiplied in the land that through these he is giving life to Egypt and all the world. Indeed, the entire world will come to him, those who bow the knee to him and will bless him. He will indeed bless with life, in this context, with grain that will keep them alive. Those who choose to curse him will eventually be cursed with starvation and death. Verse 53. Then 7 years of plenty occurred in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come, just as Joseph said. There was famine in all the lands, but in the land of Egypt there was bread. And when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. And Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, go to Joseph. What he says to you, do. So when the famine had spread over all the land, Joseph opened the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the earth came to Egypt, to Joseph to buy grain, because the famine was severe over the land. And so it's here that we see that Joseph wasn't just the local food pantry. He wasn't just keeping the world fed. He was the forerunner to the one in whom the entire world would go to for true food. He was pointing the way to the bread of life. And just as Joseph was brought from a lowly position to the most exalted person in the known world, Jesus went from being a suffering servant to being highly exalted, who now sits at the right hand of God the Father and has authority over all things in the universe. Pharaoh exalted Joseph to have a name in which all of the names of the world would come to and bow down and live. And Paul tells us in Philippians chapter 2 that God has given Jesus, has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. When the people cried out for bread, Pharaoh told them, "Go to Jesus, what he says to do, do." Jesus, through the prophet Isaiah, says, "Come, everyone who thirsts, come to the waters. And he who has no money, come, buy and eat. Come buy wine and milk without money and without price." Why do you spend your money on that which is not bread, and your labor for that which does not satisfy? Listen diligently to me and eat what is good. Delight yourself in rich food. Incline your ear to me and come to me. Hear that your soul may live. It is in Jesus that wherever we come from, whatever it is that we are experiencing, it's him that we go to find life. It is Jesus that we must praise. It is Jesus that we must go to. We must go to him to look and to live. You know, many of us have or will be traveling a road that we think is leading to where the Lord would have us go. However, we're not the driver. We're not even the navigator. We're just simply along for the ride, and we're at his mercy. But we can take heart and we can take comfort in God's sovereign plan for our lives by waiting on him, by taking confidence in him, by looking to him, and going to Jesus alone for life. Let's pray.
Thanks for listening to this message from Emmanuel Baptist Church in Mora, Minnesota. For more information about our church, you can find us on the web at www.emmanuelmora.com or on Facebook by searching for Emmanuel Mora. If you like what you've heard, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you'd like to partner with us in our mission, consider giving financially to our ministry. You can conveniently give right from your mobile device by texting any word to 320-313-1950. There are options for one-time giving or recurring gifts on a schedule that you set. Thanks again for listening. Emmanuel Mora, knowing Christ and making him known.